Morning light filters through the dusty roll-up door as it rattles upward, revealing mountains of forgotten possessions. Rebecca Wells stands at the entrance, her three children peering around her legs, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. $27. That's all she had left after the rent was paid, and she'd spent it on this abandoned storage unit. A desperate gamble for a woman whose life had become a series of desperate gambles. Her oldest, Abigail, squeezes past her, drawn to a tarnished picture frame peeking from beneath a faded tarp. The glass is cracked, but the photograph within is intact, a family smiling, standing before a sprawling Victorian home. Something about their faces feels strangely familiar. What connection could this forgotten family possibly have to Rebecca's own? What secrets might these discarded treasures hold? The kitchen clock read 5:15 a.m. as Rebecca silently closed the refrigerator door, wincing at its soft whine. The shelves were nearly empty, save for a half-gallon of milk and some wilting vegetables. Her fingers trembled slightly as she sorted through the stack of envelopes on the counter, each one stamped with bold red letters. Past due, final notice, urgent. Mom, you okay? Rebecca quickly tucked the bills into her pocket. Abigail stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, eyes too knowing for her 12 years. Just getting ready for work, honey. Go back to sleep. I can watch Jason and Emily today, Abigail offered. The weight of responsibility already settled on her narrow shoulders. Rebecca crossed the small kitchen and kissed her daughter's forehead. Not today. Mrs. Patterson's coming over. You focus on your schoolwork. 4 years. That's how long it had been since David's military transport plane went down over Afghanistan. 4 years of raising their children alone, of working extra shifts at the hospital, of pretending everything was fine when it very much wasn't. 6 months ago, Rebecca had been forced to leave her nursing job when complications with her pregnancy put her on bed rest. The irony wasn't lost on her, a nurse who couldn't take care of herself properly. David hadn't even known about this baby, their surprise, their unexpected blessing and burden. By 7:30, the small apartment hummed with morning chaos. Jason ate and, full of restless energy, spilled cereal across the table. 5-year-old Emily refused to wear anything but her princess pajamas. Abigail, always the helper, packed lunches with whatever she could find. Mom, we're out of peanut butter, Abigail called from the kitchen. Again, Rebecca sighed mentally, calculating the days until her unemployment check arrived. Too many. The phone rang. Rebecca's heart sank when she saw it was Dr. Patel's office. Another rescheduled appointment because her insurance hadn't cleared the payment. Mrs. Wells, just confirming your appointment tomorrow. Rebecca clutched the phone tighter. I thought the payment issue wasn't taken care of. The receptionist's voice brightened. Oh, someone called yesterday and settled your account balance. Rebecca frowned. Who? They didn't leave a name, just said they were a friend. After hanging up, Rebecca stared at the phone. Anonymous help had appeared occasionally since David died. Gift cards in the mailbox at Christmas, a basket of baby clothes on her doorstep. It made her uncomfortable, this invisible charity. But she couldn't afford pride anymore. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a nurse's cap, a final notice from the landlord threatened eviction in 30 days if the overdue rent wasn't paid. Next to it hung a hospital bill marked urgent for her latest prenatal complications. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in Rebecca's chest, a constant companion these past 4 years. The framed photo of David in his uniform seemed to watch her from the wall, his smile eternally frozen, unaware of how quickly his family's life would unravel after his death. In the beginning, the military benefits had been enough, but the complications with this pregnancy had drained their savings, and now... Rebecca placed her palm against the glass of the frame, a ritual she performed each morning. What would you do, David? How would you keep us afloat? The frame suddenly slipped from its hook, crashing to the floor. Glass shattered across the linoleum. Emily burst into tears at the noise while Jason ran for the broom. Abigail was already carefully picking up the larger shards. It's just bad luck, Mom. Don't worry. Bad luck. They'd had plenty of that. Rebecca carefully extracted the photograph from the broken frame, tucking it into her pocket. She'd find another frame at the dollar store. Maybe, if she could spare $1. The harsh ring of the landline cut through the morning noise. Rebecca answered, her stomach dropping as the automated voice identified the caller, Chicago First National Bank. Your account balance is negative $47.13 due to an automatic payment to Memorial Hospital. A $40 overdraft fee has been applied. Rebecca hung up the plastic receiver slick in her sweating palm. She'd forgotten about the automatic payment for her last round of tests. Now she was overdrawn with the rent due in 3 days. The room tilted slightly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. This pregnancy had been harder than the others' dangerously high blood pressure, risk of preeclampsia, and something in her blood work that had the doctors concerned. After getting the kids off to school and preschool with Abigail proudly walking her siblings to the bus stop, Rebecca collapsed onto the worn sofa. The springs creaked beneath her weight. $27. That's all the cash she had left in her purse. Not enough for groceries, certainly not enough for next month's rent. The eviction notice stared at her from across the room. 30 days to find a miracle. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nancy, her friend from nursing school. Meet at Lincoln Park, need fresh air. Rebecca hesitated, then agreed. She couldn't afford to drive, but the park was walking distance, and she did need to get out of the apartment. The walls were beginning to close and heavy with worry and uncertainty. The autumn air carried a crisp chill as Rebecca made her way to the park. Nancy was already there, 2 cups of steaming coffee in hand. Rebecca accepted hers with a grateful smile, though she shouldn't be having caffeine. One small cup wouldn't hurt, and these days small comforts were all she had. You look exhausted, Nancy said, passing her the coffee. 20, sir, Rebecca replied. That's all I have until next week. Nancy watched as some children chased each other around the playground. Have you ever been to a storage auction? My brother-in-law makes decent money buying and reselling. I don't know anything about that. There's one tomorrow at Safe Storage. Units go cheap sometimes. You might get lucky, Nancy suggested. Rebecca laughed bitterly. When's the last time I got lucky? That night, after tucking the children into bed, Rebecca stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Her reflection looked like a stranger. Dark circles under her eyes, hair hastily pulled back, skin pale. At 34, she felt twice that age. She placed her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick against her palms. We'll figure this out, she whispered. But the words rang hollow even to her own ears. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on David's shaving kit, still sitting on the shelf. She hadn't been able to put it away, this small piece of her husband's daily routine. Rebecca opened the medicine cabinet, reaching for her prenatal vitamins. Behind the bottle sat an orange prescription container, the pills inside meant to control her blood pressure. Almost empty, another expense she couldn't afford to refill. That night, she dreamed of David. He stood in a field she didn't recognize, wearing his uniform. The sunlight caught in his hair, giving him a golden halo. Rebecca tried to run to him, but her feet were mired in thick mud. David's voice carried across the distance between them. Find your way home, Becca. Then he was gone, fading like morning mist, leaving her alone in the strange field. Rebecca woke with tears on her cheeks and her heart racing. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. The baby kicked restlessly, responding to her elevated heart rate. She placed a hand on her belly, taking deep breaths to calm herself. Find your way home. What had he meant? Their apartment had never felt like home, just a place they were passing through until they could afford something better. A dream deferred by war and death and bad luck. Morning brought no relief from her anxiety. After the kids left for school, Rebecca found herself driving to the safe storage facility on the edge of town. She couldn't afford to waste gas, but Nancy's suggestion had lodged in her mind a desperate last resort. The auction was already underway when she arrived. A small crowd gathered around a storage unit filled with furniture. 200 someone called out. Rebecca watched 5 units sell, growing increasingly discouraged. Even the cheapest went for $80, far more than she could afford. The auctioneer moved to the last unit, rolling up the door to reveal piles of dusty boxes, old furniture, and what looked like endless junk. No one seemed interested. Starting bid $20, the auctioneer announced his enthusiasm noticeably diminished. Rebecca felt a strange pull and inexplicable certainty. Before she could second-guess herself, her hand was in the air. 20. No one challenged her bid. Going once, twice sold to the lady in the blue shirt for $20. As she handed over her last 20 some, Rebecca wondered if she'd just made a terrible mistake. The storage manager, a man in his 60s named Frank Thompson, approached as the crowd dispersed to the next auction location. So you're the lucky winner, he said, handing her the padlock key. Lucky isn't the word I'd choose, Rebecca replied. Frank studied her face with unusual intensity. You know, Mrs. Wells had this unit for nearly 40 years. Never missed a payment. Rebecca blinked in surprise. Wells? That's my name, Rebecca Wells. Frank's expression shifted a momentary flash of something recognition. He recovered quickly. Common name, I suppose. You've got until Sunday to clear it out. Anything left goes to the dump. Rebecca nodded, her mind racing. Wells, just a coincidence, surely. Yet something about the man's reaction troubled her. Sunday morning sun beat down on the storage facility's asphalt as Rebecca organized her reluctant workforce. This is boring, Jason complained, kicking at a cardboard box. Can't we go to the park instead? The sooner we sort through everything, the sooner we can leave, Rebecca replied, her voice firm but gentle. Abigail, you and I will check furniture. Emily, you can sort the books into piles. Jason looked through those boxes, but be careful. Don't break anything. What are we even looking for? Abigail asked, already examining a tarnished lamp. Rebecca wiped sweat from her forehead. Anything valuable, antiques, collectibles, jewelry. Mrs. Patterson said sometimes people abandon valuable things in these units. Like treasure? Emily's eyes widened as she clutched a dusty teddy bear to her chest. Maybe, Rebecca smiled, not wanting to dampen her youngest's enthusiasm. Just maybe. The work was tedious and dirty. By midday, they'd hardly made a dent in the unit's contents. Most items were disappointingly ordinary, outdated clothes, mismatched dishware, water-damaged books. Rebecca's initial optimism began to fade with each unremarkable discovery. Mom, look at this, Abigail held up a vintage wooden jewelry box with mother-of-pearl inlay. Rebecca's heart quickened as she took it from her daughter's hands. It looked genuinely antique. This might be worth something, she murmured, carefully opening the hinged lid. Inside lay several pieces of costume jewelry. Nothing gold or silver, just glass beads and faux pearls. Rebecca's shoulders slumped. It's just junk, she sighed, setting the box aside. The morning wore on, yielding nothing but disappointment. By lunchtime, Jason was sprawled dramatically across an old ottoman, complaining of boredom. Emily had colonized a corner with a collection of stuffed animals she'd excavated, while Abigail methodically sorted through a stack of vintage magazines. They ate sandwiches in the thin strip of shade beside the unit. Rebecca's back ached from bending and lifting, and her ankles had swollen in the heat. The baby shifted uncomfortably. Let's give it another hour, then call it a day, she decided. Jason groaned, but returned to his appointed task with minimal grumbling. It was Emily who found it. Mommy, look, the teddy bear has a zipper. Indeed, the worn plush bear had a small zipper concealed along its back seam. Emily pulled it open and something fell out, a tarnished brass key attached to a faded ribbon. A folded piece of paper came with it. Rebecca carefully unfolded the brittle paper. Return to Riverview Estate, 1842, Pine Hill Road. Where family belongs, it read in elegant, faded script. Rebecca turned the key over in her hand. What is Riverview Estate, she wondered aloud. Abigail, ever practical, was already typing the address into her phone. It's a big old house in Lake Forest, Mom. Super fancy area. The key felt unexpectedly heavy in Rebecca's palm, as if weighted with significance she couldn't yet understand. Jason, suddenly interested, dug deeper into the box where Emily had found the bear. Hey, there's a photo album in here. He pulled out a leather-bound album, its pages yellowed with age. The family gathered around as Rebecca carefully turned the brittle pages. Black and white photographs showed a stately Victorian mansion surrounded by manicured gardens. A family posed on its wide front porch, a stern-looking older woman, a younger woman with a kind smile, and a small boy. Rebecca froze as she turned to a close-up portrait of the younger woman. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same high cheekbones, the same slight tilt to the eyes. She looked like me, Rebecca whispered. Abigail leaned closer. Whoa, Mom, she could be your twin, or like your grandmother or something. Rebecca's hands trembled as she turned more pages. The album chronicled decades of a family's life, birthdays, holidays, graduations. The boy grew into a young man, then disappeared from the photos. The younger woman appeared in fewer and fewer images until she vanished completely. The older woman remained, her face growing more lined, her eyes sadder with each passing year. The final photograph showed the older woman alone on the mansion's porch, elderly, now still elegant, but diminished somehow. Rebecca carefully removed the photo from its mounting corners. Written on the back in shaky handwriting, Margaret Carson, Riverview Estate, 2023. Last photo before I find them. Jason tugged at another box, sending a cascade of papers sliding across the concrete floor. Mom, sorry, Rebecca and Abigail scrambled to gather the scattered documents, letters, notebooks, legal papers. A leather portfolio contained a bundle of envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon. Rebecca untied it carefully, her heart racing with an inexplicable sense of discovery. The topmost envelope contained a birth certificate for Elizabeth Wells, born 1955, to Margaret and Robert Carson. Beneath it, a marriage certificate for Elizabeth Wells and James Wells, dated 1975. A death certificate for Elizabeth Wells, 95, cancer. A military record for James Wells. Photographs of a young couple, the woman from the album now clearly identifiable as Elizabeth and a man in uniform. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The next document was a birth certificate for David James Wells, born 1988, her husband's birth certificate. Abigail looked over her shoulder, eyes wide. Mom, is that Dad's birth certificate? But I thought his parents died when he was little and he grew up with his uncle. Rebecca's mind raced. David had told her his parents died in a car accident when he was 5, that he'd been raised by his father's brother in Ohio. He'd never mentioned grandparents, certainly never spoken of a family estate. Had he known, or had this information been kept from him too? At the bottom of the stack lay a sealed envelope addressed simply to my grandson's family. With trembling fingers, Rebecca broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest ones, if you are reading this, I have finally found you, though perhaps too late for us to meet in person. My name is Margaret Carson. Was David's grandmother. My daughter Elizabeth was his mother. When Elizabeth fell in love with James Wells, a young soldier without fortune or family connections, I made the worst mistake of my life. I threatened to disinherit her if she married him. Stubborn like her mother, she chose love over wealth, and I, proud fool, that I was followed through on my threat. I cut her from my life, from our family's legacy, from Riverview. Years passed before I sought reconciliation, but by then Elizabeth and James had died in that terrible accident. David, only 5, had been sent to live with James's brother in Ohio. By the time my investigators located him, he was grown, married to you, Rebecca, with children of his own. I've watched from afar, not daring to intrude after so many years. But when I learned of David's death in Afghanistan, of your struggles, since I knew I had to find a way to bring you home. Riverview Estate is your family's legacy, as is all that comes with it. The funds, the properties, the medical research foundation, and all of it belongs to you and your children as the last of the Carson line. I am an old woman now and may not live to see you come home, but I have made arrangements. This storage unit, these mementos, breadcrumbs, to lead you back to where you belong. The key you've found opens the front door of Riverview. The home has waited for you, as have I. With love and hope for reconciliation, your grandmother, Margaret Carson. Rebecca's hands shook as she finished reading. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen, not to people like her, not when they needed miracles most. It had to be some elaborate hoax or a mistake or... Abigail picked up a photograph that had fallen from the letter, Margaret Carson standing next to Frank Thompson, the storage facility manager. The timestamp on the image showed it was taken just 6 months ago. This is that guy from the office, Mom, the one who gave you the key. Rebecca stared at the image pieces clicking into place. Frank's strange reaction to her name, his careful study of her face, his comment about Mrs. Wells never missing a payment. He had known. He had recognized her. He had been waiting for her to find this unit. As the implications washed over her, Rebecca reached for another document in the scattered pile, a newspaper clipping featuring Margaret Carson at a hospital fundraiser. The caption identified her as the founder of Carson Medical Research Foundation. A quick internet search on Abigail's phone confirmed it, a multi-million-dollar foundation specializing in maternal fetal medicine. Mom, look at this, Abigail whispered, showing Rebecca the screen. The foundation's website featured a photograph of Margaret Carson standing before Riverview Estate, the same Victorian mansion from the photo album. But the real shock came from the website's most recent update. With heavy hearts, we announce the passing of our founder, Margaret Carson, on August 15, 2024. Her legacy of medical innovation and philanthropy will continue under the direction of the board until her heir is located. 3 months ago, Margaret Carson had died just 3 months ago, never having met the family she sought to reconcile with. Rebecca sat heavily on a dusty ottoman, the letter clutched to her chest. This was real. Somehow, impossibly, this was real. Mom, are we rich now? Jason asked, breaking the stunned silence. Rebecca shook her head, not in negation, but in disbelief. I don't know, honey. I don't know what we are. The afternoon sun slanted through the storage unit door as they continued their exploration with renewed purpose. Each item now carried potential significance, not just as saleable merchandise, but as pieces of a family history Rebecca hadn't known existed. In a banker's box labeled Elizabeth School, they found notebooks filled with meticulous medical notes. Like mother, like daughter, Rebecca mused, running her fingers over the careful diagrams of human anatomy. She had followed her mother's path to nursing without ever knowing it. A leather-bound journal contained Elizabeth's personal writings, including her account of meeting James Wells at a military hospital where she worked as a student nurse. Her descriptions of falling in love, of standing up to her mother, of building a life apart from wealth and privilege resonated deeply with Rebecca. My mother believes money and status are all that matter, Elizabeth had written. But I've seen too many wealthy patients die alone, surrounded by possessions instead of love. James may be just a soldier in her eyes, but he has shown me what truly matters. I choose him, even if it means losing everything else. Deeper in the unit behind stacked boxes, they discovered a portrait in oils, a formal painting of Margaret Carson, in her prime, elegant and formidable, in a blue dress seated in what appeared to be Riverview's library. The artist had captured an intriguing duality in her expression, determination in the set of her jaw, but profound sadness in her eyes. Emily, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly squealed in delight. More stuffies. She had uncovered a cedar chest filled with immaculately preserved children's toys, teddy bears, dolls, wooden trains. Atop them lay a card in Margaret's handwriting, "For my great-grandchildren when they come home." Rebecca's throat tightened. Margaret had prepared for them, had believed they would someday find their way to Riverview, had spent decades collecting and preserving pieces of family history, creating a legacy for great-grandchildren she had never met. As the day waned, Rebecca sat amidst the scattered discoveries, attempting to process all they had learned. Her mind kept returning to the letter to Margaret's words, "Riverview Estate is your family's legacy." What did that mean in practical terms? Was it truly theirs now? Could they simply drive to this grand estate and move in? It seemed impossible, the stuff of fairy tales, not the reality of a struggling single mother weeks away from eviction. Abigail, ever the practical one, had been researching on her phone. "Mom, it says here that Riverview Estate is scheduled for public auction in 60 days if no heir comes forward to claim it. The executor of Margaret Carson's will is someone named Jack Reynolds. Should we call him?" Rebecca hesitated. What would she even say? "Hello. I found a letter in a storage unit claiming I'm entitled to a mansion and a fortune." It sounded delusional even to her own ears. She needed time to think, to verify what they'd found, to determine if this incredible story was actually true. "Let's take these important papers home first," she decided. "We'll come back tomorrow for the rest." The kids helped load the car with their most significant finds: the documents, photographs, journals, and the painting of Margaret. Rebecca carefully packed the letter in her purse, along with the brass key tied with ribbon. As they prepared to leave, Frank Thompson appeared at the unit entrance. "Find anything interesting?" he asked casually, though his eyes were keenly observant. Rebecca studied him, this man who had apparently been Margaret Carson's confederate. She decided on directness. "You knew who I was when I bid on this unit. You knew what was in here." Frank's weathered face creased in a sad smile. "Mrs. Carson had very specific instructions. The unit had to be one not given. You had to find your way here of your own accord." A test. Rebecca felt a flash of indignation. She'd spent her last dollars on this gamble. "My grandmother believed that things freely given are rarely valued," Frank explained. "She wanted you to discover your heritage, not have it handed to you. Besides, she wasn't entirely certain. She had to be sure you were truly David's widow." Rebecca's hand went protectively to her belly. "And this, did she know about this too?" Frank's eyes softened. "No, ma'am. That would have brought her great joy." Another Carson carrying on the line. The drive home was subdued, each family member lost in their own thoughts about their discovery. Rebecca's mind whirled with questions, possibilities, and yes, hope, fragile but persistent. Could this be real? Could their lives truly change so dramatically, so suddenly? At home, they spread their findings across the kitchen table. Abigail, resourceful as always, began organizing the documents chronologically. "We need to understand the whole story, Mom." Rebecca nodded, grateful for her daughter's practical approach to this extraordinary situation. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Margaret Carson, born to wealth and privilege, had inherited Riverview Estate and the Carson fortune upon her husband's death in 1970. Their only child, Elizabeth, had been groomed to eventually take over management of the family's considerable assets, including the newly established Medical Research Foundation. But Elizabeth, bright and independent-minded, had chosen a different path. After witnessing a serious car accident as a teenager, she'd become determined to pursue nursing rather than business administration. Margaret had reluctantly allowed this detour, assuming Elizabeth would eventually take her rightful place in the family enterprises. Then came James Wells, a wounded soldier Elizabeth had nursed back to health. Their whirlwind romance had outraged Margaret, who saw James as an opportunist targeting her daughter's fortune. The resulting ultimatum had severed mother and daughter completely. Elizabeth and James had married quickly and moved away, leaving no forwarding address. Years later, after Elizabeth and James died, in what the records confirmed was a car accident, Margaret had begun a desperate search for her grandson. Private investigators had eventually located David, but by then he was an adult enlisted in the military, apparently unaware of his maternal heritage. The most recent journal entries revealed Margaret's internal struggle whether to approach David directly or respect the boundaries that had been established. She had ultimately decided on observation from afar, arranging for financial assistance to be provided anonymously after his death while searching for the right moment to introduce herself to his widow and children. That moment had never come. The final entry, dated just weeks before her death, spoke of declining health and a sense of urgency. "Time grows short. I must find a way to bring them home before it's too late." Rebecca sat back, emotionally drained from absorbing this family saga. She knew what it meant to maintain stubborn pride at great personal cost. Hadn't she herself refused help until circumstances became desperate? In Margaret, she recognized a similar determination, a similar flaw, and ultimately a similar regret. Using Abigail's phone, they searched for information about Riverview Estate. The property appeared in several historical registries, a 19th century mansion built by Carson family ancestors, maintained through generations, now valued at several $1,000,000. Recent news articles discussed speculation about its fate following Margaret Carson's death, with mentions of distant relatives making claims on the estate. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching one of the antique teddy bears. Jason, despite his earlier complaints about boredom, was now thoroughly invested in their discovery, especially after learning the value of the estate. "So we're like rich now. Can I get a PlayStation 5? We don't know yet," Rebecca cautioned, not wanting to build up hopes that might be crushed. Abigail, ever thoughtful, had been quiet for some time, studying the family photographs. "You look so much like her mom, like Elizabeth. But Dad never said anything about any of this." Rebecca shook her head. "He told me his parents died when he was young, that he grew up with his uncle. I saw pictures of his parents, but..." She paused, realizing something. "Those could have been any couple. I never met any of his family. His uncle had already passed away by the time we met. Had David known? Had he deliberately hidden his heritage? Or had he truly been kept in the dark, raised without knowledge of his maternal lineage? There was no way to know now. But the resemblance between Rebecca and Elizabeth was undeniable, an eerie echo across generations that perhaps explained why Margaret had been so determined to find them. As the evening deepened into night, Rebecca made a decision. Tomorrow they would visit Riverview Estate, not to claim it, not yet, but to see it, to touch this tangible piece of a heritage that had been hidden from them, to determine if Margaret Carson's extraordinary gift was real or merely the wishful thinking of a regretful old woman. While the children slept, Rebecca continued her exploration of the journals and letters they brought home. In Elizabeth's medical notebook, she found detailed observations about a rare pregnancy complication, the same condition that had forced Rebecca onto bed rest. Elizabeth had been researching it when she died, apparently following a family interest in the disorder. A newspaper clipping from 1975 featured a young Elizabeth Wells credited with saving 5 patients from a hospital fire. The article mentioned her estrangement from prominent local philanthropist Margaret Carson, noting that Elizabeth had declined to comment on their relationship. Even in her moment of heroism, the family rift had been deemed newsworthy. Another clipping, dated 1995, contained Elizabeth's obituary, survived by husband James and son David. No mention of her mother. The estrangement had persisted until death. How tragic, Rebecca thought, that pride and misunderstanding had cost these women decades of potential reconciliation. Her exploration was interrupted by a sharp pain in her abdomen. Rebecca gasped, clutching the edge of the table. The baby kicked frantically, responding to her sudden tension. Deep breaths. Just Braxton Hicks contractions, surely. Too early for real labor. The pain subsided but left Rebecca shaken. Her condition was precarious. The doctors had been clear about that. She needed regular monitoring medication, possibly early delivery, if symptoms worsened. All things she couldn't afford, couldn't access without insurance that was increasingly unreliable. She returned to the documents, finding Margaret's medical research files. Page after page detailed the Carson Medical Research Foundation's work on maternal fetal complications, particularly the rare genetic condition that had affected Carson women for generations. The same condition Rebecca now faced. It couldn't be coincidence. This genetic quirk had been passed down lying dormant until manifesting in Rebecca's pregnancy. Margaret had spent decades funding research into treating it, research that could potentially save Rebecca and her unborn child. The realization was overwhelming. If this inheritance was real, it meant more than financial security. It could mean survival itself. Rebecca placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "We might have found our way home just in time, little one." Morning brought renewed determination. After getting the older children off to school, Rebecca called Mrs. Patterson to watch Emily for a few hours. Then, with the key and address in hand, she set out for Lake Forest, an affluent suburb north of Chicago she had rarely visited. Riverview Estate was set back from the road, partially hidden by ancient oak trees. Wrought iron gates stood open the long drive beyond, overgrown but still passable. Rebecca's aging sedan seemed conspicuously out of place as she made her way up the curved approach. The house itself took her breath away, 3 stories of Victorian grandeur, with a wraparound porch, multiple gables, and a distinctive tower room at one corner. Though clearly in need of maintenance, its bones were magnificent, its presence commanding. This was the house from the photographs, the ancestral home of the Carson family. Possibly now her home. Rebecca parked near the front steps, her heart pounding. This was madness. People like her didn't inherit mansions. There had to be a catch, a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. Yet the key in her hand felt solid enough, its weight reassuring. As she approached the front door, movement caught her eye. An elderly man emerged from around the side of the house. Frank Thompson. He nodded in greeting, unsurprised by her arrival. "You found the key, then?" Rebecca held it up wordlessly. Frank gestured toward the door. "Go ahead. See if it works." With trembling fingers, Rebecca inserted the antique key into the lock. It turned smoothly, the heavy door swinging open with a soft creak. She stepped into a grand foyer, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows above the door, illuminating a sweeping staircase and gleaming hardwood floors. Frank followed her inside. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wells. Margaret has been waiting a long time for this day." Rebecca turned to him, overwhelmed. How is this possible? Why would she leave everything to us? We're strangers. Frank's weathered face softened. Not strangers, family. The only family she had left that mattered to her. He led her through the house, each room more impressive than the last. A formal dining room with seating for 20, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a conservatory filled with dormant plants waiting to be revived. Second-floor bedrooms prepared with fresh linens as if expecting guests at any moment. It was in Margaret's study that Rebecca found the most compelling evidence of her grandmother-in-law's intentions. A wall covered in photographs, David in his military uniform, Rebecca in her nursing scrubs, the children at various ages. Surveillance photos taken from a distance. Margaret had indeed been watching them, keeping tabs on the family. She couldn't bring herself to approach directly. On the massive oak desk sat a leather portfolio containing legal documents, Margaret's will, naming my grandson David Wells, or in the event of his death, his widow and children, as the sole heirs to the Carson estate, including Riverview and all assets of the Carson Medical Research Foundation. The foundation, Frank explained, had been Margaret's life's work after Elizabeth left. Devoted to advancing maternal-fetal medicine, it had made significant breakthroughs in treating pregnancy complications, especially the rare condition that had affected Carson women for generations. The same condition threatening Rebecca's current pregnancy. "It can't be coincidence," Rebecca murmured, hand on her belly. "The foundation has been developing a treatment," Frank confirmed. Margaret hoped to perfect it in time to help future generations. She would be gratified to know it might help you. The full scope of the inheritance was staggering. Beyond the estate itself, there were investment portfolios, multiple properties in the foundation with its substantial endowment, All of it now belonged to Rebecca and her children if she could prove her right to it. The Carson family attorneys will need to verify your identity, Frank explained. There may be challenges from distant relatives. Richard Carson, Margaret's nephew, has already filed a claim. He was never close to Margaret, but with no direct heir coming forward. Rebecca's mind reeled, from impending eviction to potential heiress in the span of 24 hours. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence surrounded her. The resemblance between herself and Elizabeth in the portraits hanging in the hallway. The genetic condition connecting the Carson women across generations. The surveillance photos proving Margaret had identified them as family. As Frank continued the tour, Rebecca's phone rang, Abigail calling from school. Mom, I researched Riverview Estate more during lunch. There's going to be a hearing about Mrs. Carson's will next week. Some relative named Richard is trying to get everything. Rebecca glanced at Frank, who nodded grimly. I'm aware, she told her daughter. We're going to fight it. Abigail's voice brightened. So it's real? We're really heirs to this place. Rebecca gazed around at the grandeur surrounding her. It's real, honey. But it won't be easy. After arranging to meet with the Carson family attorneys the following day, Rebecca prepared to leave Riverview. There was so much to process, so many details to address. The children needed to be told. Plans needed to be made. A legal battle needed to be fought. As she stood on the front porch, key in hand, the magnitude of Margaret's gift washed over her. Not just the wealth or the property, but the connection to a history, a legacy, a family they hadn't known existed, a chance at security when they'd been on the brink of disaster. Rebecca turned to Frank. Why did she wait so long? Why watch from afar instead of just approaching us? Frank sighed, his expression somber. Pride. The same pride that drove her to cut Elizabeth off in the first place. She was afraid you would reject her as she had rejected her own daughter. She couldn't bear to face that possibility. Pride and fear. Rebecca understood both all too well. How many times had her own pride prevented her from seeking help when she desperately needed it? How often had fear of rejection or humiliation kept her isolated in her struggles? In Margaret's story, she recognized reflections of her own. As Rebecca prepared to leave, a sleek black Lexus pulled into the driveway, cutting off her exit. A well-dressed man in his late 50s emerged, his expression hardening at the sight of Frank. Thompson, I thought I made it clear you're trespassing on private property. Frank stood straighter. The estate is not yours, Mr. Carson, and I have every right to be here at Mrs. Wells's invitation. The man's gaze shifted to Rebecca, taking in her pregnant form, her modest dress, her aging sedan. So you're the mysterious heir my aunt supposedly left everything to. Richard Carson. And you must be the gold digger trying to steal my family's legacy. Rebecca bristled. I'm Rebecca Wells, David's widow. I didn't know about any of this until yesterday. Richard's laugh was cold. How convenient. My aunt was a senile old woman, by the end easily manipulated. Whatever scheme you've concocted won't work. My lawyers will ensure Riverview stays with legitimate Carson blood. Rebecca's hand went protectively to her belly. This child carries Carson blood, as did my husband. Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Listen carefully. I don't know who you are or what you're after, but Riverview has been in my family for generations. I will not let some desperate, single mother from the wrong side of town walk away with it. Take whatever Frank has offered you and disappear, or I will make this extremely unpleasant for you and your children. Rebecca had faced worse threats than this man's contempt. 4 years of struggling alone had hardened her against intimidation. I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Carson, and I'm not going anywhere. This is my children's inheritance, and I intend to protect it. As Richard continued to sputter threats, Frank gently guided Rebecca to her car. Don't let him rattle you. The law is on your side. The will is clear. Still, he's powerful in this community with connections. Be prepared for a fight. Rebecca nodded, a new resolve settling in her chest. I've been fighting for my family's survival for 4 years. This is just one more battle. On the drive home, Rebecca's mind raced with plans and possibilities. If the inheritance was legitimate, and all evidence suggested it was, their lives would change dramatically. No more overdue bills, no more choosing between medicine and food. A home that could never be taken from them. Security for her children's future. But wealth brought its own complications. A move to an affluent community where they would be outsiders. the responsibility of managing a historic property and a medical foundation, the resentment of family members who believed themselves more deserving, and the fundamental question of whether they belonged in Margaret Carson's world at all. By the time Rebecca collected Emily from Mrs. Patterson's and returned to their apartment, school was letting out. Abigail met her younger siblings at the bus stop, her expression eager for news. "Did you see it? What was it like?" Rebecca ushered the children inside before answering. "It's magnificent. And yes, it appears to be ours if we can prove our claim against a cousin named Richard, who's contesting the will." That evening, as Rebecca prepared dinner from their meager supplies, she explained as simply as she could what they had discovered. A great-grandmother they hadn't known existed, a family legacy hidden from them, a potential inheritance that would change everything. The children responded with varying degrees of understanding and excitement. Later, after the younger ones were in bed, Rebecca and Abigail sat at the kitchen table examining the documents they'd found in the storage unit. "Mom, why wouldn't Dad have told us about any of this?" Abigail asked the question that had been haunting Rebecca as well. "I don't know, honey. Maybe he didn't know himself. Or maybe he had his reasons for keeping it private." The photo of David in his uniform seemed to watch them from its place on the counter where Rebecca had propped it after the frame broke. So many questions she would never be able to ask him. So many mysteries that would remain unsolved. But the path forward was becoming clear, illuminated by Margaret's posthumous gift, a legacy reclaimed, a family reconnected across generations, a future secured when all had seemed lost. Rebecca's hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby shift within. This child would never know David, nor Margaret, nor Elizabeth. But unlike its siblings, it would be born into security rather than struggle. It would grow up in the home its ancestors had built, surrounded by the history of the family, whose determination and resilience it carried in its blood. As she prepared for bed that night, Rebecca felt a strange sense of peace, despite the uncertainty ahead. The eviction notice still hung on the refrigerator, the bills still waited to be paid. Richard Carson's threats still echoed in her mind. But for the first time in 4 years, there was hope, tangible, substantial hope, that tomorrow might be better than today. The brass key to Riverview lay on her nightstand, catching the moonlight through the thin curtains. It represented more than access to a house. It was the key to their future, to the legacy that had been waiting for them, to the home they hadn't known they'd lost. Rebecca picked it up, feeling its solid weight in her palm. She had spent 4 years simply surviving, keeping her head above water, protecting her children from the worst of their circumstances. Now perhaps they could begin to thrive. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Richard's opposition, the complexities of wealth, the responsibilities of the Carson legacy, they would face them together as a family. Outside, the city hummed with nighttime activity. Inside their small apartment, the home that had never quite felt like home, Rebecca finally allowed herself to believe in the impossible. Margaret Carson's final gift wasn't just the estate or the fortune. It was the chance to begin again, to reclaim what had been lost, to find their way home at last. The wrought iron gates of Riverview Estate loomed before them, no longer simply an entryway, but a threshold between their past life and whatever awaited beyond. Rebecca gripped the steering wheel, suddenly hesitant, despite the brass key weighing heavy in her pocket. The children pressed their faces against the car windows, eyes wide, at the sprawling grounds now bathed in morning light. "We're really going to live here," Jason's voice carried equal parts excitement and disbelief. Rebecca guided their aging sedan up the winding driveway, conscious of how out of place it looked against the manicured landscape. The Victorian mansion emerged from behind ancient oaks, its gabled roof and ornate trim more imposing in daylight. Frank Thompson awaited them on the front steps, his weathered face breaking into a welcoming smile as they approached. Abigail helped Emily from the car, while Jason bolted toward the house, already claiming exploration rights. Rebecca moved more carefully, one hand supporting her lower back, the other protectively covering her belly. The baby had been restless all morning, as if sensing the momentous change underway. "You're making the right decision." Frank's eyes crinkled with approval as Rebecca climbed the steps. Margaret would be pleased to see the house filled with family again. Rebecca wasn't entirely convinced trading their cramped apartment for this sprawling estate before legal matters were settled felt premature, perhaps even reckless. But with eviction looming and Richard Carson's threats escalating, Frank's suggestion to establish physical presence at Riverview made strategic sense. The grand foyer welcomed them with streaming sunlight through stained glass transoms, illuminating marble floors and a sweeping staircase. Emily twirled in a patch of colored light, delighted by the rainbow patterns dancing across her skin. Jason had already disappeared down a corridor, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. Rebecca couldn't help comparing this moment to their first apartment tour with David, a one-bedroom walk-up they'd been thrilled to afford, on his military salary planning to upgrade once he returned from deployment. Frank led them through the main floor, each room more impressive than the last. The formal dining room could seat 20 beneath a crystal chandelier. The library housed thousands of leather-bound volumes behind glass-fronted cases. The conservatory, though currently neglected, promised botanical wonders once restored. Upstairs bedrooms awaited with freshly made beds, as if Margaret had perpetually anticipated their arrival. "I took the liberty of preparing the East Wing for your family." Frank gestured down a hallway lined with portraits of Carson ancestors. "It offers the most privacy and has convenient access to the nursery Margaret renovated 3 years ago." Rebecca paused before the nursery door, startled. 3 years ago would have been shortly after she'd announced her pregnancy with Emily on social media. Had Margaret been monitoring them that closely? The nursery stopped her breath. Walls painted soft yellow with a lamb motif, an antique crib positioned to catch morning light, a rocking chair cushioned in luxurious fabric. A collection of vintage toys arranged on shelves, children's books alphabetized in a small bookcase. Not hastily prepared, but lovingly curated over years, waiting for occupants who never came. "Some things were already here from when Elizabeth was a baby," Frank explained. Margaret kept updating it over the decades, hoping someday it would cradle her great-grandchild. Rebecca ran her fingers over the crib's smooth wood, imagining Margaret alone in this room, arranging and rearranging, preserving hope across decades of estrangement. Their exploration continued to the third floor, where an unexpected feature delighted the children: a tower room with windows facing all four directions, offering panoramic views of the estate. Emily dubbed it the Princess Tower immediately, while Jason was more impressed by the telescope positioned to observe the surrounding landscape. Frank saved the basement for last, not the dank cellar Rebecca expected, but a fully equipped laboratory space. Margaret converted it 20 years ago for the Foundation's research, he explained. "Most work happens at the main facility now, but she kept this for her personal projects." Rebecca examined the state-of-the-art equipment, the organized cabinets of chemicals and compounds, the meticulous research notes in Margaret's handwriting. The focus was unmistakable: treatment protocols for the same pregnancy complication currently threatening Rebecca's health. William escorted them to what would be Rebecca's bedroom, the former master suite, Margaret's own chambers. A large four-poster dominated the space, flanked by antique nightstands. Family photographs lined the dresser, including several surveillance images of Rebecca and the children. "Not creepy at all," Abigail murmured, examining a photo of herself at a school science fair 2 years earlier. The adjacent sitting room had been converted to a home office, with Margaret's personal records arranged in filing cabinets. A leather portfolio on the desk contained documents Frank identified as critical: the complete will, property deeds, foundation, bylaws, investment portfolios. Rebecca skimmed the materials, overwhelmed by their complexity. The foundation alone managed an endowment of $40 million. "For decades, I managed smaller matters, but Margaret employed a team of professionals for the larger estate," Frank acknowledged. "You'll need to meet them soon. I've arranged for her attorney to visit tomorrow." The attorney's name caught Rebecca's attention: Jack Reynolds, the same name that had appeared in news articles about the estate's contested future. That afternoon, while the children explored their new surroundings under Frank's guidance, Rebecca retreated to the office to study the documents more thoroughly. The will was explicit. Margaret Carson left her entire estate to "my grandson David Wells," or in the event of his death, his widow Rebecca and their children. The language was unambiguous, the document properly witnessed and notarized. Yet Richard Carson had apparently filed challenges based on claims that Margaret had been unduly influenced in her final years. A knock at the door interrupted her reading. William had returned with tea and sandwiches. "You need to keep up your strength," he insisted. "The baby, too." Rebecca realized she'd forgotten to eat lunch, her nurse's training momentarily criticizing this oversight. The baby responded with a firm kick, as if agreeing. William lingered as Rebecca ate. "I served the Carson family for 47 years, he revealed. Started as a groundskeeper when Margaret's husband was still alive, worked my way up to house manager. Stayed on after his death, after Elizabeth left, after everything changed. I've never seen Margaret as hopeful as when she finally located your family. Rebecca set down her cup. Why didn't she just contact us directly? All this surveillance, these preparations. Why not simply introduce herself? William's expression clouded, fear of rejection. The one thing Margaret Carson couldn't face was being turned away by her own blood as she had once turned away her daughter. The irony wasn't lost on her, but pride and fear are powerful forces. Their conversation was interrupted by commotion downstairs. Voices raised in argument, children's footsteps hurrying up the stairs. Rebecca moved toward the hallway as Abigail appeared breathless. Mom, there's a woman here, says she's from the Historical Society and needs to inspect the house. In the foyer stood a formidable woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed, clipboard in hand. Her gaze swept critically over Rebecca's casual attire. You must be the storage unit people, as the locals have taken to calling you. Victoria Harrington Lake Forest Historical Society. This property is registered with our Preservation Council. The woman's disdainful tone set Rebecca's teeth on edge. Yes, I'm Rebecca Wells, Margaret Carson's granddaughter-in-law. Victoria's eyebrows arched. Indeed. Well, regardless of the unusual circumstances, Riverview Estate is a historic landmark. We conduct quarterly inspections to ensure maintenance standards are being met. Frank stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between the women. Mrs. Harrington, I've overseen Riverview's maintenance for decades. The inspection isn't scheduled until next month. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Given the change in occupancy, we felt a special assessment was warranted to ensure the new residents understand their preservation obligations. The condescension in her tone wasn't subtle. Rebecca straightened one hand, instinctively cradling her belly. I'd be happy to review your guidelines, and I'm open to suggestions as we settle in. This transition has been significant for my children. Victoria's gaze lingered on Rebecca's pregnant belly. Yes, I imagine so. Such a fortunate change in circumstances. After the woman departed, Frank huffed indignantly. The nerve Victoria Harrington barely spoke to Margaret when she was alive. Now she presumes to instruct you on how to maintain your own home. She's just protecting her property values, Rebecca replied, with more understanding than she felt. Having storage unit people move into the grandest house in the neighborhood must be concerning. That afternoon, while exploring a cedar chest in what would become the baby's nursery, Rebecca discovered a collection of handmade baby clothes, yellowed with age but exquisitely crafted. Beneath them lay a letter addressed simply to my great-grandchild. I prepared this nursery decades ago, Margaret had written, hoping someday it would cradle Catherine's grandchild. I've since updated it several times as styles changed, always maintaining the yellow wallpaper, with little lambs that Catherine loved as a baby. Whatever life brings you, little one, know that you were loved and anticipated long before your arrival. Rebecca glanced around the sunny yellow nursery with its lamb-patterned wallpaper. The crib and rocking chair, all waiting, all prepared by a great-grandmother who had never given up hope of family returning to fill these rooms. For the first time since discovering their connection to Riverview, Rebecca felt something beyond shock or practical consideration, a sense of rightness of completion, as if scattered puzzle pieces were finally joining. That evening, as they gathered for dinner in the formal dining room, an extravagance that made Rebecca slightly uncomfortable, Jason announced with childish bluntness, Lisa Miller from school says we're only rich because we tricked some old lady. Abigail shot him a warning look, but Rebecca addressed the comment directly. People often fear what they don't understand. We know the truth that Margaret wanted us here, that this is our rightful home. But why did she want us? Emily asked, twirling spaghetti around her fork. She didn't even know us. Rebecca considered this understanding dawning as she spoke. Because family is about more than knowing each other. It's about belonging together even when circumstances keep you apart. That night, Rebecca stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens of the Carson estate. Her gardens, now her responsibility, her legacy to preserve for her children. For the first time, the magnitude of what Margaret had entrusted to her felt not like a burden, but a blessing. Morning brought Jack Reynolds, Margaret's attorney, a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. His resemblance to David was subtle but unmistakable. The same square jawline, the same slight crease between the brows when concentrating. Rebecca tried not to stare as he spread documents across the library table. I served with David in Afghanistan. Jack revealed, noting her attention. We weren't in the same unit, but we crossed paths several times. When I returned to civilian life and joined my father's law firm, I had no idea one of our major clients was searching for David's family. Rebecca's heart stuttered. You knew David, and you knew about Margaret's search. Jack's expression turned regretful. I made the connection too late. By the time I realized that David Wells in Margaret's search files was the same man I'd known in service, he had already been killed. I considered contacting you directly, but Margaret insisted on following her plan. She believed you needed to find your own way here. The weight of these connected threads, David, Margaret, Jack, all intersecting in ways none of them had fully recognized, left Rebecca momentarily speechless. How many near misses had there been? How different might their lives have been if these connections had been made sooner? Jack shifted to practical matters. The DNA test results confirm your children's direct lineage to the Carson family. Combined with the documentation you found and the explicit language in Margaret's will, your claim is legally sound. However, Richard Carson has significant resources and appears determined to contest everything. The initial hearing is scheduled for next week. Rebecca's hand went to her belly, a now habitual gesture of protection. What exactly is Richard claiming? Jack's expression hardened. That Margaret was mentally incompetent when she made her will, that she was manipulated by unnamed parties. That as a blood relative, he has stronger claim than the widow of a grandson Margaret never actually met. All lies, Frank interjected from his position by the doorway. Margaret was sharp as a tack until the end, and she documented everything: her search for Elizabeth's family, her eventual discovery of David, her decision to leave everything to his line. Jack nodded agreement. The documentation is thorough. Margaret was nothing if not meticulous. But Richard has connections in this community, and the idea of the entire Carson fortune passing to, he hesitated. To storage unit people, Rebecca finished dryly. That's what they're calling us, right? The family from the storage auction? Jack had the grace to look embarrassed. Community perception shouldn't matter in court, but realistically, it might influence proceedings. Richard has been spreading rumors, positioning himself as the rightful heir, protecting the family legacy from opportunistic strangers. Rebecca processed this information, anger, mixing with determination. We didn't ask for any of this. We didn't even know Margaret existed until after her death. But she wanted us here, wanted my children to have this legacy, and I won't let Richard steal what she intended for them. As Jack packed up his materials, he hesitated before leaving. There's something else you should know. Richard has been making inquiries about your medical history. Rebecca's breath caught. How would he know about my condition? Jack's expression confirmed her suspicion. The Carson family medical history is well documented, as is the Foundation's research focus. If Richard learns you have the same condition Margaret studied, he'll use it to claim I targeted the family for their medical research, Rebecca concluded. Exactly. Jack's concern was evident. Be careful what you share with whom. Richard is looking for any angle to discredit your claim. The warning settled heavily as Rebecca showed Jack out, adding another layer of complexity to their already precarious situation. Later that afternoon, Abigail found Rebecca in Margaret's office surrounded by Foundation documents. Mom, I think you should see this. She held out her phone displaying a local news website. The headline sent a chill through Rebecca. Carson estate controversy, opportunistic nurse claims inheritance through tenuous connection. The article quoted sources close to the family, describing Rebecca as a struggling single mother who had suddenly appeared claiming inheritance rights despite Margaret Carson never having met her or her children. It implied Rebecca had somehow engineered the situation, exploiting an elderly woman's regrets for financial gain. Rebecca scrolled through comments beneath the article, each more vicious than the last. Gold digger, con artist, those poor Carson millions going to welfare rats. The cruelty was breathtaking. How could they judge so harshly without knowing anything about her, about Margaret, about their family's actual story? Abigail watched her mother's face carefully. They're wrong about us, right? We really are supposed to be here. Rebecca pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. Yes, Margaret wanted us here. She spent decades searching for us. Whatever Richard or the community thinks, we know the truth. The days before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation. Rebecca met with doctors at Carson Medical Research Foundation, confirming her pregnancy complication matched the genetic condition Margaret had studied. Dr. Howard Chen, the Foundation's lead researcher, was particularly interested in her case. Margaret always believed finding her family wasn't just about reconciliation, he explained. The medical research had personal urgency. She wanted to protect future generations of Carson women from the condition that had complicated her own pregnancy with Elizabeth. The foundation's work had progressed significantly in recent years, with promising treatment protocols ready for clinical trials. Rebecca's case could provide valuable data, and the treatment might protect her and her unborn child from the complications that had forced her onto bed rest. Rebecca agreed to begin the experimental protocol, grateful for this unexpected medical lifeline. Meanwhile, the children were adjusting to Riverview with varying degrees of success. Emily took to their new circumstances like a fairy tale princess, delighting in the tower room and expansive gardens. Jason fluctuated between excitement over the estate's treasures and anxiety about fitting in with neighborhood children who viewed him with suspicion. Abigail, ever sensitive to undercurrents, grew increasingly protective of her mother as community whispers reached her ears. Frank became their guide and ally, introducing them to Riverview's history and operations. He showed Jason the carriage house where vintage automobiles slumbered beneath dust covers. Margaret's husband had been a collector. He taught Emily which garden flowers were safe to pick and which were merely for admiring. He helped Abigail discover the estate's extensive archives, where family photographs and journals documented generations of Carson history. Rebecca divided her time between medical appointments, legal preparations, and learning to navigate their new reality. The estate's daily management was more complex than she'd imagined, staff to coordinate systems, to understand finances, to review. Margaret had left comprehensive instructions, but the learning curve remained steep. The night before the hearing, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She wandered Riverview's silent hallways, eventually finding herself in the library, where family portraits watched from gilt frames. Margaret's formal painting hung above the fireplace, the formidable matriarch in her prime, eyes sharp with intelligence. "What would you do in my position?" Rebecca asked the silent image. "How would you fight your own nephew for what you wanted us to have?" A leather-bound volume caught her attention. Margaret's personal journal, its final entries dated just weeks before her death. Rebecca hesitated, then opened it, feeling only slightly intrusive. The elegant handwriting filled page after page with Margaret's private thoughts, her regrets over Elizabeth, her desperate search for David, her joy at discovering his family, her anguish over whether to approach them directly. "I watched them from afar," Margaret had written. Rebecca struggling so bravely with the children. "The same determination I see in old photographs of Elizabeth. The same Carson stubbornness, though she doesn't know it's her inheritance. My investigators report her pregnancy is showing signs of the family condition. I've instructed the foundation to accelerate the treatment protocol. If only I could approach her directly and offer help. But after what I did to Elizabeth, what right do I have to insert myself into their lives?" Rebecca continued, reading, tears welling, as Margaret chronicled her internal debate, the longing to connect, the fear of rejection, the determination to make amends through her will, if not in person. The final entry was dated 3 days before Margaret's death. "I haven't much time left. Frank will ensure they find their way home after I'm gone. Richard suspects something. He's been asking questions, reviewing foundation records. I've taken precautions, documented everything. The estate must go to David's family. They are the true Carsons now. May they forgive my cowardice in not reaching out while I could." Rebecca closed the journal, overwhelmed by Margaret's posthumous presence. "Not cowardice," she whispered to the empty room. "Fear. The same fear that keeps all of us from risking our hearts sometimes." The courtroom felt cavernous, its wooden benches filled with curious community members drawn by the controversial case. Rebecca sat beside Jack at the plaintiff's table, acutely aware of the stares directed her way. Behind them sat Frank, providing moral support. Across the aisle, Richard Carson and his legal team projected confidence, occasionally glancing at Rebecca with barely concealed disdain. Judge Eleanor Simmons, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, called the hearing to order, establishing parameters for what would be discussed. "This is not a full trial, merely an initial hearing to determine if Richard Carson's objections have merit to proceed further." Jack had prepared Rebecca for this, explaining that their goal was to have Richard's objections dismissed entirely, allowing the will to be executed without further delay. Richard's attorney presented first a polished performance painting, Margaret as an elderly woman consumed by regret, manipulated in her final years into changing her will to benefit strangers. She never met these people, he emphasized, never established any relationship with them. Her supposed grandson died before she ever located him. The attorney gestured dramatically toward Rebecca. And now, this young woman with no blood connection to the Carson family seeks to claim one of the largest estates in Lake Forest. The insinuation hung heavy in the courtroom. Rebecca forced herself to maintain eye contact with the judge, though her cheeks burned with indignation. Jack had advised her to appear confident, but not arrogant, sympathetic, but not pitiable. A delicate balance. When Jack rose to respond, his approach was methodical. He presented the DNA test results, confirming the children's Carson lineage. He submitted Margaret's meticulous records documenting her search for Elizabeth's family. He called Dr. Chen to testify about the genetic condition affecting Carson women for generations, and the same condition now complicating Rebecca's pregnancy. Most devastatingly, he produced surveillance videos from Margaret's security system, showing Richard searching her office in the weeks before her death, removing documents from her files. The courtroom murmured with this revelation. Richard's face darkened as Jack suggested he had deliberately withheld information about David's family once he discovered Margaret's intentions. Finally, Jack called Frank Thompson to testify about Margaret's mental state in her final years. Sharp as ever, Frank affirmed, physically weakening, but mentally acute until the end. She knew exactly what she was doing with her will, exactly who she wanted to inherit. There was no manipulation, no undue influence, just a grandmother's desire to make amends with the family she'd lost. Throughout the proceedings, Rebecca maintained her composure, though fatigue and stress took their toll. By midday, she felt lightheaded, the baby unusually active. During a brief recess, Dr. Chen noticed her discomfort and discreetly checked her blood pressure. "It's elevated," he murmured. "You should be resting, not sitting in court all day." Rebecca shook her head. "I need to be here. This is about my children's future." Dr. Chen's concern deepened. "Margaret would not want you risking your health or the baby's. The treatment protocol is working, but stress counteracts its benefits." When proceedings resumed, Judge Simmons invited Rebecca to make a statement, an unexpected opportunity Jack hadn't prepared her for. Standing before the court, Rebecca felt a moment of panic. Then her gaze fell on Abigail, who had insisted on attending, sitting beside Frank with unwavering support in her young eyes. "I didn't know Margaret Carson existed until after her death." Rebecca began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I didn't know my husband came from wealth, or that his grandmother had been searching for him for decades. We were struggling, truly struggling, when I found that storage unit. I spent my last $27 on what I thought was a desperate gamble to find something, anything to sell, so my children wouldn't go hungry." She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "What I found instead was a family history I never knew existed. A grandmother who spent decades searching for reconciliation. A medical legacy that might save this baby's life. The Carson family condition affects me too, not because I engineered some elaborate scheme, but because my husband carried Carson blood, and now my children do as well." Rebecca turned slightly, addressing Richard directly. "I understand your suspicion. From your perspective, we appeared from nowhere to claim an inheritance you believe would be yours. But Margaret made her choice based on blood and family connection, the same connection she lost with Elizabeth decades ago. She wanted to make amends the only way she could. My children are Carson heirs, whether you accept us or not." The courtroom remained silent as she concluded. "I'm not asking for sympathy or special treatment. I'm only asking that Margaret's clear wishes be respected. She wanted her great-grandchildren to grow up at Riverview. She wanted her medical research to help future generations of Carson women. She wanted to bring her family home. That's all we're trying to do, honor her final wishes by coming home." Judge Simmons studied Rebecca thoughtfully before turning attention back to the attorneys. After brief closing arguments, she announced she would review the evidence and issue a ruling the following morning. As the courtroom dispersed, Rebecca felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Dr. Chen was immediately at her side, supporting her elbow. "Hospital," now he insisted. "These symptoms need immediate attention." Rebecca tried to protest, but the room tilted alarmingly. Jack's face swam before her concern, etching his features. "I'll drive you," he offered. "Frank will stay with the children at Riverview." The contractions started in the car, mild at first, then increasingly intense. Too early, Rebecca gasped. "I'm only 32 weeks. The emergency room staff recognized Dr. Chen, immediately expediting Rebecca's admission. Preeclampsia, the ER doctor confirmed after initial examination. "We need to stabilize her blood pressure and monitor the baby." Rebecca's mind raced with worry, not just for herself and the baby, but for the hearing outcome for her children waiting at Riverview, for the uncertain future still hanging in the balance. Jack remained in the waiting room making calls to arrange childcare and update Frank. Through the treatment haze, Rebecca heard Dr. Chen explaining the experimental protocol she'd begun, suggesting modifications to the standard preeclampsia treatment. The Carson family condition required specialized management, exactly what Margaret's foundation had been researching for decades. Hours blurred as medications dripped into Rebecca's veins. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking her condition, and medical personnel came and went with efficient concern. The contractions eventually subsided, her blood pressure slowly stabilizing. The baby's heartbeat remained strong, a reassuring rhythm in the clinical chaos. Dawn broke as Rebecca finally drifted into exhausted sleep, the crisis temporarily averted. She didn't hear Jack enter her room, didn't see him place the legal document on her bedside table, didn't witness his gentle smile as he whispered the news she'd been fighting for. Judge Simmons had issued an emergency ruling given Rebecca's medical situation. Richard Carson's objections were dismissed in their entirety. Riverview Estate and the entire Carson fortune officially belonged to Rebecca and her children, exactly as Margaret had intended. Rebecca woke to sunlight streaming through hospital blinds and Jack dozing in the visitor's chair. The events of the previous day flooded back the hearing, her collapse, the medical emergency. Her hand went instinctively to her belly, relieved to feel movement beneath her palm. The baby was still safely where it belonged. Jack stirred, immediately alert when he saw she was awake. The judge ruled in our favor, he announced without preamble. Full dismissal of Richard's claims. Riverview is officially yours. Rebecca tried to process this news through lingering medication fog. It's over, we won. Jack's smile was genuine but tempered. The initial battle, yes. Richard will likely appeal, but this ruling establishes strong precedent. More importantly, your medical situation demonstrated exactly why Margaret's research foundation is so vital to your family. The Carson condition is part of your children's inheritance too. Rebecca's doctor arrived, interrupting further discussion. The treatment protocol was working, but Rebecca would need to remain hospitalized for at least a week. Complete bed rest thereafter until delivery, which they would schedule at 36 weeks if all remained stable. The baby's lungs were being developed with medication to prepare for potential early arrival. As medical staff conducted their morning assessment, Rebecca's thoughts drifted to Riverview, to Emily and Jason and Abigail adjusting to their new reality, to Frank maintaining the estate in her absence, to the nursery prepared decades ago by a grandmother determined to welcome family home someday. Through circumstance and struggle, through loss and discovery, they had finally found their way there. What happens now? She asked Jack when they were alone again. The legal battle might be won, but the practical challenges remain daunting. A pregnant woman on bed rest, 3 children adjusting to a new environment, a vast estate and foundation to manage, a hostile community to navigate. Jack's response was unexpectedly personal. I made a promise to David in Afghanistan, though he never knew it. When we talked about family, about hopes for the future, I silently promised that if anything happened to him, I'd look out for his loved ones. I never imagined it would unfold like this, but the promise stands. You're not alone in this, Rebecca. For the first time since David's death, the weight of solitary responsibility lifted slightly from Rebecca's shoulders. The Carson legacy wasn't just wealth and property, it was connection, belonging, family extending beyond blood to encompass those who chose to remain loyal. Margaret had tried to rebuild those connections too late in life. Rebecca vowed not to make the same mistake. A soft knock preceded Abigail's entrance, her young face simultaneously worried and relieved at seeing her mother awake. Frank's with Jason and Emily at the house, she reported. Richard came by this morning, but Frank wouldn't let him in. He just stood there yelling about appeals and fraud until the police came. Rebecca sighed, unsurprised by Richard's reaction. The Carson stubbornness Margaret had written about clearly ran throughout the family, even in branches that had grown distant from the main line. We'll deal with whatever comes next, she assured her daughter. For now, Riverview is our home, exactly as Margaret wanted. As Abigail settled beside the hospital bed, pulling out schoolwork to complete during her visit, Rebecca gazed out the window toward the direction of Riverview. Not visible from here, but present in her thoughts, the estate that had waited decades for family to return, the legacy Margaret had preserved. Through years of estrangement and regret, the home that had called to them through a chance storage auction and a brass key tied with faded ribbon. The journey from desperate survival to inherited wealth had been dizzying in its speed, bewildering in its implications. Yet beneath the practical challenges and ongoing conflicts lay something precious, a sense of belonging, of connection across generations, of finding one's rightful place after years of displacement. Whatever battles still awaited with Richard, whatever adjustments their new life would require, whatever responsibilities the Carson legacy entailed, they would face them from a position of security rather than desperation. Rebecca's hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. This child would be born into the family. Margaret had longed to reunite, would sleep in the nursery, prepared decades ago, would carry the Carson medical legacy, but also benefit from the research Margaret had championed and would never know the struggle for basic survival that had marked its siblings' early years. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in dollars or property deeds, Rebecca realized. The true Carson legacy wasn't Riverview's grand architecture or the foundation's substantial endowment. It was resilience passed through generations, determination in the face of challenges, the capacity to build new beginnings from painful endings. Those qualities had brought them home at last. Spring sunshine bathed Riverview Estates gardens in golden light as Rebecca Wells guided her wheelchair along the stone path. 6 weeks of hospital confinement had left her pale but resolute, her body slowly recovering from the emergency C-section that had brought Margaret Elizabeth Wells into the world 4 weeks premature. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, swaddled in a vintage blanket found among the treasures Margaret Carson had preserved for her great-grandchildren. Dr. Chen walked beside her, monitoring her progress with professional attention tinged with personal concern. "You're healing well, but don't overdo it. These gardens will still be here tomorrow." Rebecca nodded, though her gaze continued to sweep over the sprawling landscape with a proprietary awareness that still felt foreign. Riverview's extensive grounds had begun their spring awakening during her absence, daffodils nodding in the breeze, cherry trees crowned in pale pink blossoms, fresh green, shoots emerging in carefully maintained beds. Frank Thompson supervised a team of landscapers near the property's eastern boundary, directing the removal of winter debris with the confidence of decades' experience. He waved when he spotted Rebecca, genuine pleasure lighting his weathered features. The children trailed behind the wheelchair, Abigail vigilant in her self-appointed role as mother's helper, Jason and Emily competing to point out garden discoveries to their convalescing parent. "Look, Mom!" Emily tugged at Rebecca's sleeve, pointing toward a marble bench partially hidden by ornamental shrubs. "Grandma Margaret's special spot Frank showed me yesterday." She watched the whole garden from there. Rebecca guided her wheelchair toward the secluded nook, noting the strategic vantage point that overlooked both the formal gardens and the distant main gates. A perfect observation post for a woman who had watched her family from afar, afraid to approach but unwilling to abandon her vigil. The baby stirred tiny fingers, flexing as she yawned. Rebecca adjusted the blanket, studying the delicate features that somehow combined Carson elegance with Wells' determination. Little Margaret, already nicknamed Murda Maggie by her siblings, had survived her premature arrival with remarkable resilience, demonstrating what Dr. Chen called classic Carson fortitude during her 2 weeks in neonatal intensive care. Homecoming had been delayed by medical necessity, Rebecca and baby Maggie remaining under close supervision until both were deemed stable enough for release. The experimental treatment protocol, developed by the Carson Foundation, had ultimately proven effective, preventing the worst complications of Rebecca's condition and giving Maggie precious additional weeks of development before her early delivery became inevitable. Now, 3 days into their new life at Riverview, Rebecca was gradually reacquainting herself with the estate that had transformed from miraculous discovery to actual home during her hospital confinement. The children had adapted with surprising ease, guided by Frank's patient mentorship and Jack Reynolds' regular visits. Abigail had established herself as mistress of the East Wing, organizing her siblings' daily routines with precocious efficiency. Jason had discovered the extensive Carson Library of military history, developing a sudden interest in his heritage through martial achievements of ancestors. Emily had claimed the tower room as her personal domain, converting it into an elaborate play space where stuffed animals attended daily tea parties. Dr. Chen checked his watch, professional responsibility reasserting itself. "Time to head back. You need your medication and Maggie will want feeding soon." Rebecca acquiesced without argument, her body's limitations impossible to ignore, despite her desire to explore further. The wheelchair turned toward the mansion, its Victorian grandeur still striking even after multiple viewings. Riverview's stone edifice gleamed in the spring sunlight, windows flashing like diamonds, fresh paint accentuating architectural details that had been meticulously maintained through decades of Carson family pride. Inside, the foyer's marble floor reflected dappled light from stained glass transoms. Rebecca's wheelchair left faint tracks on the polished surface as Dr. Chen guided her toward the newly installed elevator, one of several accessibility modifications implemented during her hospital stay. Jack's doing, Frank had explained when she first noticed the changes, said you shouldn't have to choose between recovery and accessing your entire home. The elevator deposited them on the second floor, where the master suite had been temporarily reconfigured as a recovery space. Medical equipment, shared room with antique furniture, modern necessity, blending with historical elegance in a combination that somehow characterized their entire current situation. Rebecca settled into the adjustable bed, accepting the medications Dr. Chen dispensed with the resigned cooperation of someone accustomed to medical routine. Her gaze drifted to the window as Dr. Chen examined the baby. Beyond Riverview's manicured grounds lay Lake Forest's exclusive community, a social ecosystem as structured as the formal gardens below, with boundaries equally well maintained. Their integration into this rarefied environment remained tentative at best, actively hostile at worst. Victoria Harrington's inspection had been merely the first in a series of community assertions that the Wells family remained under scrutiny, their claim to Carson heritage viewed with persistent suspicion despite legal confirmation. Dr. Chen completed his examination with evident satisfaction. She's gaining weight appropriately and all reflexes are normal. You've got a fighter here. Rebecca smiled, maternal pride temporarily displacing social concerns. The Carson women are nothing if not resilient, or so I'm learning from the family journals. Dr. Chen nodded, gathering his equipment. Margaret would be pleased to see her medical legacy continuing, both through the foundation's work and through her great-grandchildren. After he departed, Rebecca fed Maggie while reviewing foundation documents Jack had left for her consideration. The Carson Medical Research Foundation's governance structure required revision now that Margaret's heir had been identified. As legal guardian of Margaret's great-grandchildren, Rebecca automatically assumed a position on the board of directors with responsibility for overseeing the foundation's substantial endowment and research priorities. The documentation overwhelmed with its complexity, financial statements detailing millions in assets, research protocols, comprehensible only to medical specialists, legal terminology requiring translation, even for someone with Rebecca's healthcare background. A note in Jack's handwriting offered reassurance. Don't worry about understanding everything immediately. The foundation has excellent staff who've managed operations for years. You'll grow into this role gradually. A soft knock preceded Frank's entrance, his arms laden with fresh flowers for the bedside table. From the conservatory, he explained, arranging blooms with unexpected artistry. Margaret always insisted on fresh flowers in the sick room, said it reminded patients that life continues even during convalescence. Rebecca breathed in the delicate fragrance, grateful for this small continuity between past and present, between Margaret's world and her own emerging place within it. Frank lingered, his expression suggesting unspoken concerns. Rebecca had learned to read his weathered features during their brief acquaintance, recognizing the particular furrow between his brows that signaled community complications. What's happened now? She prompted. The Historical Society has called an emergency meeting about Riverview's status. Victoria Harrington is suggesting your lack of experience with historic properties warrants special oversight provisions. Rebecca sighed, unsurprised. The Lake Forest elite had maintained polite hostility since her legal victory, their social machinery mobilizing to maintain control over what they clearly considered communal heritage rather than private property. Jack's handling the legal aspects, Frank continued, but he suggests making some gesture toward community integration, perhaps hosting a small reception to introduce yourself properly. Let them see you're not planning to install vinyl siding or convert the place to condominiums. Rebecca's laugh held minimal humor, because that's exactly what a single mother of four would do with a historic mansion, turn it into a construction project. Frank's expression remained serious. These people protected Margaret in their way even when they found her eccentric. They're concerned about Riverview's future, which isn't entirely unreasonable, given its historical significance. Rebecca conceded this point with reluctant fairness. The estate represented Lake Forest heritage beyond Carson family history. Its preservation mattered beyond personal ownership. A more immediate concern interrupted their discussion as Abigail appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled. "There's a man downstairs who says he's Dad's friend from the Army, says his name is James Wilson." Rebecca's heart stuttered with unexpected recognition. James Wilson, David had mentioned him frequently, a fellow soldier from his first deployment. They'd lost touch during David's final tour connection, severed by combat reassignments and operational security. "Send him up," Rebecca instructed after a moment's consideration. Frank's protective instincts visibly engaged, but he withdrew with respectful acknowledgement of her authority. Moments later, a tall man with military bearing appeared, his confident stride betraying only slight hesitation at the threshold of her room. James Wilson had aged since the photographs David had shown her years earlier. Hair now salted with gray lines etched around his eyes, but remained recognizable as the young soldier who had stood beside her husband in desert camouflage, arms slung around each other's shoulders in brotherhood forged through shared danger. Rebecca Wells. His voice carried complex emotions, respect, curiosity, and something less definable. "David talked about you constantly during deployment. Showed your picture to everyone who'd look. I always promised I'd meet you someday, though I never imagined it would be like this." Rebecca studied him, searching for deception, but finding only genuine connection to her husband. "Why now, after all these years?" James moved further into the room, gaze briefly registering the sleeping infant before returning to Rebecca. "I only learned about David's death when I returned from my final deployment 2 years ago. By then, the contact information I had was outdated. I've been searching for you since, but—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing Riverview's grandeur. "I wasn't looking in places like this." The explanation rang true. Military service disrupted normal communication patterns, created gaps in awareness that could span years rather than months. Rebecca had experienced similar disconnections during David's deployments, information arriving in irregular bursts rather than continuous flow. Her defensive posture relaxed slightly. "How did you find us?" James's expression shifted toward embarrassment. "Newspaper articles about the Carson inheritance case. Your picture was in the Chicago Tribune. I recognized you immediately." Rebecca winced, remembering the media frenzy that had followed Judge Simmons's ruling, sensationalized accounts of storage unit mother strikes gold, alongside more sober legal analyses of inheritance precedents. Maggie chose that moment to awaken tiny fists, waving as she announced her displeasure at some infant discomfort. Rebecca adjusted her position, soothing the baby with practiced motion. James watched with visible emotion. "She has David's chin." The unexpected observation, accurate in ways only someone who had known David well could identify, dissolved Rebecca's remaining suspicion. She has his determination too. Nothing stops her when she wants something, even at 3 weeks old. Their conversation unfolded gradually, initial awkwardness, giving way to shared memories of David, James offering stories from deployment that David had never shared, Rebecca reciprocating with domestic anecdotes unknown to his military brothers. The exchange created a strange intimacy, expanding their respective understandings of the man they had both loved in different ways. James revealed he had left the military 2 years prior, using his GI Bill benefits to complete engineering studies. He currently worked for a security consulting firm in Chicago, specialized knowledge of defense systems, translating effectively to civilian applications. "I was actually in Lake Forest for a client meeting when I saw the article about Riverview. Couldn't believe the coincidence." As their conversation continued, Rebecca found herself relaxing into unexpected comfort with this connection to David's past. James possessed a straightforward quality, reminiscent of her husband's directness, tempered with compassion, practical capability, balanced by emotional intelligence. When he finally rose to leave, promising to return if she permitted, Rebecca found herself nodding agreement before conscious decision formed. Frank reappeared almost immediately after James departed, his expression guardedly neutral. Rebecca recognized the careful non-reaction as his method of respecting her autonomy while maintaining protective vigilance. "He seemed genuine," she offered. Frank's nod acknowledged her assessment without fully endorsing it. Margaret would advise caution with newcomers appearing after inheritance announcements. Rebecca sighed, familiar with this perspective from recent experience. Not everyone is Richard. The following days established new routines as Rebecca's strength gradually returned. Mornings began with Dr. Chen's visits initially daily, then every other day, as her recovery progressed according to expectation. Foundation staff arrived for scheduled consultations, educating her about operations she now oversaw, seeking guidance on decisions that technically required her approval, though she barely comprehended their implications. Jack Reynolds maintained regular presence, managing legal aftermath of their court victory, while fending off Richard Carson's increasingly desperate appeals. Richard's last filing was dismissed with prejudice. Jack reported one afternoon satisfaction evident beneath professional restraint. The judge was particularly unimpressed with his attempt to claim you somehow orchestrated Margaret's health decline through stress of discovery. Community integration proceeded less smoothly. Victoria Harrington's Historical Society meeting had indeed implemented special monitoring provisions for Riverview, requiring quarterly inspections and prior approval for any structural modifications. Jack had negotiated some compromise protections for family privacy, but the underlying message remained clear. The Wells family remained on probation in Lake Forest Society, their stewardship of Carson heritage viewed with ongoing skepticism. The children experienced similar mixed reception. Abigail's academic excellence earned reluctant recognition from teachers initially prepared to find her education lacking. Jason encountered more overt resistance, neighborhood boys excluding him from activities with deliberate calculation. Emily, too young for complex social navigation, remained happily oblivious within her tower sanctuary, creating elaborate imaginative worlds rather than engaging with potentially hostile peers. James Wilson's visits became semi-regular occurrences, initially focused on sharing David's memory, but gradually expanding to include practical assistance as Rebecca's recovery allowed greater mobility. His engineering background proved unexpectedly valuable when examining Riverview's aging infrastructure, identifying necessary repairs before they became emergencies. His military training translated to security assessments that addressed vulnerabilities Frank had noted, but lacked technical knowledge to remedy. 4 weeks after homecoming, Rebecca sat in Margaret's office, now her office, though she still mentally assigned ownership to the woman whose presence permeated the space. Financial statements spread across the antique desk, their contents simultaneously encouraging and overwhelming. The Carson fortune exceeded initial estimates. Investments diversified across markets with characteristic thoroughness. Beyond Riverview itself lay multiple properties: a lakefront cottage in Michigan, an apartment in Chicago, undeveloped land in Wisconsin apparently acquired decades earlier for conservation purposes. The foundation's endowment operated separately from family assets, but demonstrated similar robust health funding research programs at 3 major universities while maintaining its independent laboratory facility. Rebecca had toured this operation the previous week, doctoral researchers and laboratory technicians explaining their work with enthusiasm that temporarily transcended awareness of her owner/director status. Rebecca's nursing background provided basic comprehension of the medical research, though its sophisticated genetic components exceeded her training. She recognized enough, however, to appreciate the foundation's significance. Its work on maternal-fetal complications represented cutting-edge science with implications far beyond the Carson family condition. The experimental protocol that had protected her pregnancy could eventually benefit thousands of women facing similar complications. This awareness intensified her determination to honor Margaret's legacy through proper stewardship. Whatever social resistance they encountered, whatever adjustments their new circumstances required, Rebecca remained committed to preserving what Margaret had built not merely for her own children's benefit, but for broader humanitarian impact the foundation could achieve. Such lofty considerations occupied her thoughts when Frank interrupted with uncharacteristic urgency. Richard Carson's car just passed through the gates. He appears intoxicated and is making threats. Rebecca's protective instincts immediately engaged. "Where are the children?" "Abigail has them in the East Wing playroom," Frank reported. "I've instructed them to remain there until further notice." Rebecca nodded approval, leveraging herself carefully from the desk chair. Still recovering from surgical delivery, her movements lacked customary efficiency, but conveyed determined purpose. "I'll handle Richard." Frank's objection formed visibly before finding voice. "You're still recovering. Let me call security or the police." Rebecca shook her head, decision firm. "He's angry and humiliated. Adding outside authorities will only escalate the situation. Margaret would want family matters handled within family when possible. She descended to the foyer as Richard's vehicle screeched to stop on the circular driveway, gravel spraying beneath abrupt braking. Through leaded glass windows, she observed his unsteady exit from the driver's seat, physical coordination compromised by what appeared to be significant intoxication. His dishevelment suggested prolonged deterioration. Wrinkled clothing, unshaven face, general disregard for the impeccable appearance he had maintained during court proceedings. Rebecca opened the front door before his uncoordinated fist could make contact. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with his agitated state. "Richard, this isn't a good time for an unannounced visit." Richard's bloodshot eyes narrowed, hostility radiating from his unsteady stance. "Not welcomed in my own family home by some interloper, some nurse who manipulated a senile old woman." Rebecca maintained composure with conscious effort, recognizing dangerous combination of intoxication and wounded pride. "Margaret wasn't senile, her decisions were legally sound, and I didn't manipulate anyone. You're upset and clearly not sober. Why don't you come back tomorrow when we can discuss whatever's concerning you rationally?" Richard lurched forward, alcohol overwhelming ingrained social restraint. The Carson fortune passed through generations. Generations only to end up with storage unit people. With some military widow and her brats, fury contorted his features into unfamiliar configuration, aristocratic composure abandoned in raw emotional display. Rebecca stepped backward, maintaining distance without retreating completely. "I understand you're disappointed, but this display isn't helpful. Margaret made her choice based on blood connection, not social status. My children are Carson descendants, whether you accept that reality or not." Richard's bitter laugh held no humor. Blood connection to a grandson she never met, to great-grandchildren she never knew existed. Margaret was obsessed with making amends for Elizabeth, with recreating some fantasy family she destroyed through her own stubbornness. You were just convenient vessels for her delusion. Though crude in delivery, his assessment contained uncomfortable fragments of truth. Margaret's motivation had indeed involved complex guilt regarding Elizabeth's desire for generational reconciliation, perhaps overwhelming rational consideration. Rebecca acknowledged this complexity while rejecting his dismissive characterization. Margaret wanted her bloodline to inherit her legacy. That choice deserves respect, regardless of your personal feelings about it. Richard swayed slightly, alcohol compromising his balance alongside his judgment. "You have no idea what you've stolen from me. I had plans for Riverview development plans that would have transformed the property, created something magnificent. Instead, it will slowly decay under the care of people who can't possibly understand its significance or potential." Rebecca detected genuine anguish beneath his entitlement, recognizing that Richard's connection to Riverview, while different from her own, carried emotional validity she couldn't simply dismiss. "What kind of development?" The question emerged from genuine curiosity rather than strategic engagement. Something in her tone penetrated Richard's hostile defenses. His expression shifted, anger temporarily displaced by enthusiasm that suggested the plans had engaged his genuine passion rather than mere financial calculation. Mixed-use development, preserving the historic mansion while activating the ground's luxury condominiums, boutique retail, high-end dining. Riverview would become a destination rather than a deteriorating relic. Rebecca considered this vision, understanding its entrepreneurial logic while recognizing its fundamental incompatibility with Margaret's intentions. The estate wasn't meant to be developed, Richard. Margaret preserved it as a family home, not a commercial opportunity. Richard's momentary openness collapsed, bitterness resurging. "Of course you'd say that. You've got your meal ticket secured. Why risk actual vision or innovation?" The conversation's potential for constructive engagement evaporated with his renewed hostility. Rebecca recognized the futility of continued interaction given his current state. "Please leave, Richard. Come back when you're sober if you want to discuss anything further." Her tone left no room for negotiation, authority established through calm certainty rather than aggressive assertion. Richard's response defied expectation, not escalating confrontation, but sudden emotional collapse, shoulders slumping as anger transmuted to despair. "I've got nothing left," he admitted, alcohol dissolving inhibitions that might otherwise have contained such vulnerability. The development partners withdrew after the final ruling. My personal investment in preliminary planning is gone. The family looks at me like I failed them. Rebecca's nursing instincts engaged despite herself, compassion activating in response to genuine suffering, regardless of its source. How much have you had to drink? Richard waved dismissively. Rejection of concern rather than denial of intoxication. Doesn't matter. Nothing matters now. The situation's potential danger shifted from confrontation to self-destructive risk. Rebecca made swift decision based on professional assessment rather than personal inclination. You shouldn't be driving. Let Frank call you a car service. Richard's laugh emerged harsh and brittle. Carson charity for poor disgraced Richard. The ultimate humiliation. Frank materialized in the doorway, summoned by some sixth sense for developing crises. I've already called for a driver, he announced with diplomatic certainty that suggested no possibility of refusal. They'll take you wherever you need to go, Mr. Carson. Richard seemed about to object, then abruptly surrendered, fatigue and intoxication overwhelming oppositional energy. As they awaited the car service, awkward silence descended. Rebecca finally broke it with unexpected offer. If you're genuinely interested in discussing development possibilities for some portions of the Riverview grounds, I'm willing to listen when you're sober. Not condominiums or retail, but perhaps limited initiatives that honor Margaret's intentions while creating something new. Richard's bloodshot eyes registered surprise, suspicion, gradually yielding to cautious consideration. Why would you even entertain such discussion? You've won everything. Rebecca's response emerged from recent reflection on her new responsibilities. Because Riverview isn't just my family's home, it's part of Lake Forest heritage. Responsible stewardship might include thoughtful evolution alongside preservation. Margaret would want the estate to remain relevant rather than becoming a museum frozen in time. The car service arrived before Richard could formulate response. Professional driver maintaining neutral expression while assisting his unsteady client into the vehicle's rear seat. As the car disappeared down Riverview's winding drive, Frank voiced the concern evident in his expression. You're not seriously considering development schemes. Rebecca sighed, complexity of her emerging role, settling with tangible weight upon her shoulders. Not as Richard initially imagined them, but his observation about decay wasn't entirely wrong. Maintaining Riverview as is requires enormous resources and serves limited purpose beyond our family's comfort. There might be middle ground between preservation and transformation. Frank's expression suggested skepticism tinged with reluctant consideration. Margaret was certainly open to evolution, he acknowledged. The Foundation's research facility was built on former pasture land, the conservation property in Wisconsin, established when original family hunting grounds became environmentally significant. She wasn't opposed to change that aligned with Carson values. This conversation continued as they returned inside focus, shifting from Richard's disruption to broader questions about Riverview's future. The estate's extensive grounds offered possibilities beyond current utilization portions, potentially serving community needs while maintaining family privacy, generating revenue to support maintenance costs while preserving historical integrity. Rebecca found herself unexpectedly energized by these considerations. Practical challenges engaging problem-solving capabilities that had lain dormant during recovery. Her nursing background had developed analytical skills applicable beyond medical context assessment of complex situations, identification of core needs versus peripheral concerns, balancing competing priorities within resource limitations. Later that evening, as she nursed Maggie in the nursery Margaret had prepared decades earlier, Rebecca contemplated the strange, circuitous path that had led her family to Riverview. From desperate poverty to extraordinary wealth, from anonymous struggle to public scrutiny, from isolated survival to complex community integration. Each transition required adaptation that tested their resilience while creating opportunities previously unimagined. The children had demonstrated remarkable flexibility throughout these changes. Abigail had gradually relaxed her hyper-responsible stance as security replaced precariousness, allowing occasional childish behaviors previously suppressed by premature burden-bearing. Jason had discovered academic interest beyond immediate practical application, historical curiosity blossoming within Riverview's resource-rich environment. Emily had expanded her imaginative play to include elaborate narratives about Carson ancestors, incorporating family history into fantasy worlds with seamless creativity. Baby Maggie, knowing no other reality than Riverview's sheltered luxury, represented their future untainted by prior struggle. Her development would occur within parameters unimaginable for her siblings. Her inheritance including not merely material wealth, but freedom from fundamental insecurity. Rebecca felt simultaneous gratitude for this blessing and concern about potential entitlement such circumstances might engender without careful parental guidance. A soft knock preceded James Wilson's unscheduled appearance, his expression apologetic for the evening interruption. Frank mentioned there was trouble with Richard Carson. Thought I'd check if everything's okay. Rebecca nodded, appreciating his concern, while noting Frank's evolving trust evidenced by information sharing previously withheld. James moved further into the nursery, gaze softening as it fell upon Maggie's drowsy form. The room's peaceful atmosphere contrasted sharply with Richard's earlier disruption. Representing the sanctuary, Rebecca continuously strove to maintain amid external pressures. I've been thinking about the security upgrades we discussed, James continued. With Richard potentially unstable, it might be prudent to expedite installation. Rebecca agreed, recent confrontation reinforcing previously theoretical concerns. Richard's evident decline suggested unpredictability that warranted precautionary measures, particularly with children's safety as primary consideration. They discussed technical specifications with comfortable efficiency, James's expertise complementing Rebecca's practical prioritization and collaborative problem-solving that had become their interaction pattern. As their conversation concluded, James hesitated before departing, uncharacteristic uncertainty briefly visible in his typically confident demeanor. I'm returning to Chicago tomorrow, but wondered if you might consider dinner next week. Not here at Riverview, somewhere neutral, just to talk. Rebecca recognized the invitation's potential implications movement from friendship toward possibility of deeper connection. Her immediate instinct balanced caution against loneliness, recognition of David's continued presence in her heart against acknowledgement of ongoing life's demands. I'll need to arrange childcare and check with Dr. Chen about activity restrictions, but yes, I'd like that. James's smile combined pleasure with patience, acknowledgement of her complex circumstances without resentment of limitations they imposed. I understand your family comes first. Whenever works for your situation, works for me. His uncomplicated acceptance of her priorities reinforced Rebecca's comfort with tentative step toward expanded relationship, however it might eventually develop. After his departure, Rebecca completed Maggie's feeding and settled her in the antique crib that had awaited Carson descendants for decades. The nursery's yellow walls glowed softly in lamplight, lambs dancing across vintage wallpaper. Margaret had preserved through years of emptiness and hope. Rebecca touched one delicate painted figure, connecting across time with the woman who had prepared this room for children she feared she might never meet. We made it home, Margaret, she whispered to the quiet room. Your family found their way back, just as you hoped. The inheritance you left us goes far beyond Riverview's walls or the foundation's endowment. You gave us security when we were desperate, purpose. When we were lost, connection when we were alone. Whatever challenges we still face, whatever adjustments our new life requires, we'll honor your legacy by building upon what you preserved. Returning to her bedroom, Rebecca paused at the window overlooking Riverview's moonlit gardens. The estate stretched before her, not merely property but responsibility, not simply shelter, but legacy spanning generations. Her gaze traveled beyond immediate grounds to distant lights of Lake Forest community recognition, of broader context in which their family story now unfolded. The journey from storage unit discovery to Riverview stewardship had transformed not merely their circumstances, but their identities, connecting past with present, grafting their modest family tree onto Carson's established roots, creating foundation for future generations they could previously scarcely imagine. Margaret's posthumous gift had provided not merely material security, but existential continuity, sense of belonging within longer narrative than individual lives alone could encompass. Spring's gentle breeze carried promise through partially open window renewal growth possibility, emerging from winter's dormancy, just as hope had blossomed from their desperate circumstances. Rebecca breathed deeply, accepting both gift and challenge of their inheritance. Tomorrow would bring foundation meetings, continued. Recovery, parenting responsibilities, community navigation, potential, relationship exploration, complex tapestry of obligations and opportunities requiring strength. She sometimes questioned, But Carson women possessed determination beyond ordinary measure, resiliences through adversity, vision, beyond immediate circumstance qualities. Margaret had recognized in Rebecca, even from distant observation, characteristics now consciously embraced as birthright rather than mere survival necessity. Whatever tomorrow might demand, she would meet it with this heritage, consciously claimed this legacy, actively continued this responsibility, willingly shouldered. The brass key that had unlocked Riverview's front door now rested on Rebecca's bedside table, its practical purpose fulfilled but symbolic significance ongoing. It represented not merely access to physical property, but unlocking of potential previously constrained, opening of possibilities previously unimagined, connection to history previously unknown. Rebecca lifted the key briefly before returning it to its place of honor, its weight familiar in her palm, its significance permanently altered by journey from mysterious storage unit discovery to conscious inheritance acceptance. No longer simply entry mechanism to grand estate, it had become tangible representation of Margaret's final gift. The key to home, to security, to belonging, to future built upon reconciliation rather than estrangement. What begins in desperate gamble sometimes ends in rightful restoration, she reflected. What appears coincidence often reveals pattern only visible in retrospect. What seems ending frequently contains beginning waiting to emerge. Margaret had understood these truths through decades of patient waiting. Rebecca embraced them now through active stewardship of legacy. Finally claimed inheritance, rightfully assumed family. Finally, after long separation, returned home at last.